Hello, everybody. First of all, I would like to apologize for not giving this talk live. The reason is that my broadband is rather shaky, and although I probably wouldn't have been cut off completely, it keeps cutting off half my sentences. So I thought it would be best to pre-record this, and then we can have a discussion later on. So today I will be presenting my work on the Norse waterways in the West Mainland of Orkney. So a really important point that I would like to make before I go into the main part of the presentation is to tell you that the results that I'm going to be talking about today is something that we've achieved together as a team. So I've been working with Barbara Crawford of St Andrews, and she's also a visiting professor with the Institute for Northern Studies where I work. And other team members are Richard Bates of St Andrews and Martin Bates in Wales. And this project is inspired by some of the earlier research that Barbara did, and particularly on the West Mainland. And one of the most important articles for me was the one that I've added the reference to here. It was published in 2006, and it's called Husaby, Harry and Narston on the West Mainland of Orkney, Toponymic Indicators of Administrative Authority. And this article, she outlined some of the key earldom farms in this area, and also highlighted that many of the place names suggest that this part of the West Mainland was much wetter in the Norse period than it is now, and that there are place names that suggested that boats, or perhaps even ships, had made it into areas that now are definitely inland. And I read this and I thought this is really, really interesting, and it fitted in with some of my previous thoughts that I'd had on the administrative organisation of Orkney. I've been working particularly on thing sites, ting sites, assembly sites, whatever you want to call them, but the court and parliament sites of the Viking Age and the Norse period in Scandinavia, in Iceland and the Faroes, etc., and also in Orkney. And we'll come back to this topic later. And also the time when I was living in Orkney, I spent a lot of time driving around the West Mainland and studying the landscape. And just from that, it's clear that these areas were possibly a lot wetter in the past than they are today. So that's how it all started. So a point that I would like to make, first of all, is to do with the place names. So the place names really constitute the main source material, at least for the earliest part of this project. And as I just outlined, Barbara's early research was very much focused on the place names. And the place names can be quite tricky to work with. And there are, many reasons for this. They can be difficult to interpret. But one big reason is, of course, that they are recorded quite late. So the initial Norse settlement of Orkney seems to have happened in the 9th century, especially from the middle of the 9th century. That's when we see the first evidence of proper settlement. And in the course of the late 9th century or the 10th century, the Orkney earldom was created. And this is described in the Orkney saga, and Orkney became part of the Norwegian kingdom. It's of course important to remember that the Orkney saga is a product of the 13th century, and when describing events of the 9th and 10th century, it's not always perhaps fully reliable. But the saga contains a number of farm names and some topographical names, but does not provide sort of a full rundown of all the place names in Orkney, of course. And then Orkney remained part of the Kingdom of Norway until 1468, when it was instead integrated into the Scottish Kingdom. And we can see increased Scottish influence in Orkney over time, especially from the 1350s. But what's important then is that the place names that we see were created in this period of Norse settlement, and some then appear in the Orkney saga, very few, and most of them are not recorded in writing until much later, particularly the Orkney rentals, where we have many farm names recorded. And the earliest one is from 1492, and there are some later ones. But that's quite a long way away from the Viking Age itself. And then we have other place names too that we perhaps can spot on maps, etc. And many of them are recorded even later. So that means that the place names it can be tricky to work with. And if you have read about place names, you know that there are different interpretations of the same name. So this project was focused then on the West Mainland, and this is a key area for the power of the Norse Earls. One big reason for this, of course, is that it's a highly fertile landscape, so it was really useful and successful area for agriculture. And we can see that many earldom power centres were located here. Above all then, the Earldom Centre at the Brochabyrsi, of course, but there are also many other estates on the West Mainland that seems to have been linked to the power of the Earls. So something that was highlighted by Barbara in the article I mentioned are the farms that end with staðir, or in the Old Norse, they end with staðir. And they seem to be preceded by a personal name a lot of the time. So Korsta and Clouston are examples of this, and they are found around the lochs of Harry and Stennis, and they seem to have been farms that were held by the Earls, but they were donated to allies to create strong links and strong bonds. So we can see that many of the people who seem to be working very closely with the Earls had their estates in this particular area. Then we have another really important farm, and of course we mentioned already, and that's the Husaby farm, Husaby, and that's found in Harry, next to Sabiston Loch. And this place name is derived from the Old Norse word Husabyr. And this type of place name, then, Husaby, is found in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, and with different spelling variations, but they all derive from the Old Norse term. So in Sweden, it's spelt Husaby with an A, and in Norway and Denmark is Husaby with an E. And this place name translates as farm with many houses or farm with many buildings. And these place names have been studied for quite a long time, and many different theories have been put forward as to why farms with this particular name appear across the Scandinavian kingdoms and also then in Orkney. The most recent consensus is that these farms were part of a royal system that was introduced with the growth of kingship in the 11th century. So at this time, the Scandinavian kingdoms, they had been officially Christianized, and there were the royal powers were being strengthened, and the kings could exercise powers over much greater areas. So this was the time of unification for the Scandinavian kingdoms, and therefore it seems logical that it is at this time that the kings were also perhaps for the first time in a position where they could start collecting taxes properly from the wider population. And these farms seems to have been created for the collection of taxes in kind. So if you can imagine maybe cattle, sheep, and food produce was being brought to these farms, and that could well explain why they needed to have so many different houses or buildings. And what seems to have happened is that kings took existing farms and renamed them Husaby to signal their special function, so that it was clear to the local population to which farm they should be bringing their taxes. And these farms, they share many traits and characteristics, although you can also see slight variations between them, between different geographical areas. So as I said, these farms are found across all the Scandinavian kingdoms, and I thought I would use Denmark as an example to show you where these farms are located. So in Denmark, there are 7 Husaby farms known, and they have been mapped. And if we look at the different islands of Denmark, we can see that most of these farms are located by the coast. So very, very easy to get to in terms of transportation. Then there's 1 or 2, number 1 and number 5, that are not directly on the coast, but they are situated by major inland waterways. And so this is the pattern that we really see with the Husabys, and it really depends on the local area. So Denmark, of course, with its many islands and big coastline, it's natural that we see so many along the coast. In Sweden, where it's a much bigger kingdom with huge inland areas, we see many of these farms being located inland, but on those occasions, they are most of the time by major water routes, so that transport could have been taking place by boat to these farms. And on many occasions as well, we find these farms on places where these major water routes met with important land routes. So this is the pattern that we see in Scandinavia. So what about Orkney? And I will take that on the next slide. So the Orkney Husabys have been researched for quite a long time, and particularly in the 1950s, there were some major works produced about these farms. And Barbara and I have also been working on the Husaby farms, and we published an article in 2016, and you can see the reference here in the blue box at the bottom of the slide. So that article is entitled "The Orkney Husaby Farms, the Onomastic, Historical and Archaeological Context." And of course, we did build on early research that had been carried out, but we mapped these place names. And you can see, if you remember what we saw from Denmark, you can see a very, very similar pattern for Orkney. So that they seem to be located in coastal locations and in places where there are good harbours. All of them. I should mention that the Husabay here is an old place name. You know, the location does look right, but it's recorded very late, and it doesn't. So it's very likely that this is actually not a real Husaby in Old Norse term. And then we have Orfer, which either the Orfer farm itself or a neighbouring farm was a Husaby farm, and that's something that's implied by the Orkney saga. So we have this coastal location for all these farms, but of course we've got the Husaby in Orkney mainland that does not fit the picture. Of course, here on this map here, I haven't got the inland lochs, but even so, we know that the Husaby is located, quite some distance today from the lochs. So 3 kilometers from the Loch of Harry, and not accessible by boat. So let's take a look at some of the place names that Barbara presented in her article of 2006, when she picked out a number of place names that indicated the presence of water very close to the Husaby farm. So just to, first of all, we've got the Husaby farm here next to the Loch of Sabiston. And that township, Sabiston, is documented in 1492 as Sebusta, which can be translated as sea farm from the Old Norse, sail bolstader, and say there refers to an inland sea or an arm of the sea, which is really interesting, and you'll see as we go on how that particular name seems very, very significant. To the north of Sabiston, we've got Greeny here, and that name can be translated as shallow waters. And then to the west of Sabiston, not marked on this map unfortunately, we have Swartland Farm, which can be translated as Blackland, and that's located 1 kilometre to the west of Sabiston. And this name then seems to refer to the very sort of dark and mossy nature of the soil. So again, you know, it's wet soil. Then we have another really interesting place name, which I will show you on the next slide. So this place name is Narston, and it's derived from the Old Norse knarrstaðir, and that seems to be derived from the word knarr, which is a transport vessel, so a boat. And today then, looking at the location of Narston, it's not in a place where boats could travel to. It's not a place where boats could be kept. So that was one of the most intriguing names that Barbara discussed in her 2006 article. So we're thinking that perhaps this was a farm where vessels were kept. And I should say that there is a different interpretation of this name as well, and that is that it contains, the first part is a personal name, and that is a possibility. But it's important to know that in Norway there are a number of Narston equivalents of place names derived from knarrstaðir, and in Norway they are found in places that are significant for transport routes and places that have connections with the sea or with rivers, and therefore it's very clear that the name there really implies vessels. And also in Orkney there are two other place names, Narston place names, and they are both located by the sea. One is in Scapa Bay, the other one is found in Rousey, and that one is really interesting because it is only 4 kilometers from the Husaby name in Rousey. So here we seem to have a similar connection then with the Husaby and the Narston place name. So let's look at some of the place names in the area and some of the other ones, and they also suggest the presence of water and possibly ships too. So we have Tufta, just to the north of Harry Loch, and there are a huge number of drainage ditches in this area, and these ditches sort of lead into an area that on the present maps is marked as Orshan, and that is a really interesting name because it can be translated as grouse tarn, so a small lake, and it's derived from the Old Norse Ori and Churn. Then we have another Tufta place name in the north, just by Bordhouse Loch. And if we look at the translation by Marwick, in Orkney farm names, he suggests, yes, this is from the Old Norse tupt, translates as old house or building site, and this is the common meaning in Orcadian names. But again, if we go across and look at the usage in Scandinavia, we can get some different suggestions for interpretations as well. Because in Norway in particular, we can see links between this place name, Tuft, and Tofte, which means a rower's seat or a thwart, so something's connected with boats and ships. And it's been suggested that farms with this name, this particular name, were obliged to provide a rower for the laydown ships. So the laydown is, by the Middle Ages, when this is recorded in writing, it was a coastal levy that everybody paid to keep the defence fleet and to provide and to keep this fleet going. So tupt also at times denotes boathouse foundations, and perhaps that's something that we could see for Orkney. It's a possible interpretation of these two names, bearing in mind the overall context of water that we can see in these two areas. Then there's another further interesting place name. So it's a Skibray. Different spellings occur, and the first element may be derived from scathe, as in fast warship, and that's something that differs from Marwick's interpretation, and he says that this is derived from a horse racetrack, and that is one of the common interpretations of this name. But we're just bringing this up as a possibility when we are considering the wet nature of this area. So the topography of the West Mainland is, of course, really, really important as well. And by studying topography, we can get a much better idea of what the West Mainland looked like in the Old Norse period. And this suggests that this area was much, much wetter in the past. And looking at the map from 1882 issued by the Ordnance Survey, there are many areas that are marked as liable to floods. And if you look on the map on your right, you see these little blue squiggles, and they show all these areas that are liable to flooding. And what we can also see is that the natural watercourses were heavily modified through drainage ditches and channels that were dug out. And the ones that are marked on the 1882 map can be seen on this map too. So you can see how this area, particularly then north of the Loch of Sabiston and leading up to the Loch of Banks, was heavily modified. So when this project first started, we began by really looking into detail in many of the early maps, because maps can give us really, really good insight into the landscape of the past. So we've got Mackenzie's coastal chart of 1750, James Storrett's 1750 land maps, and the 19th century Ordnance Survey maps that I just mentioned to you. And in addition to these maps, we've also been using aerial photography surveys, so sent up drones to take photographs of the area that we were studying, and there's of course a lot of online images available from Google Earth. And by looking at the earliest maps, then the maps from the 750s, it seems quite clear that there was natural drainage at this point in time, particularly around Harryloch to the north, the west, and the east of this loch. And but by the time we get to the first Ordnance Survey maps in the late 19th century, the landscape had already been changed dramatically because of the agricultural drainage systems that had been dug. And by looking at all these maps and sources together, we could identify areas in the West Mainland where we can see the potential for infilled streams and lochs. And by using these results, we could then identify the areas that we wanted to use for further investigation. So then it was time for field work. And but the last step before actually going out to the field as well was using all the data from the mapping and to create digital terrain models or elevation models, and particularly then to analyze the flow of the water, to calculate the flow or direction, the amount of water that would have been moving, etc. And I'll show you some of the results on the next slide. But the aim of the fieldwork then was to explore natural channels under the modern day topsoil. And the fieldwork was carried out at key locations in places where the modelling had predicted that channels should be in place. And it was done by two main methods. So the first was geophysical remote sensing. So that it was carried out through sending down electricity down through the earth, and depending on what signals come back, we can determine whether there are, natural or indeed man-made channels here. And the other main method of the field work was to take core samples. So by augering down into the soft sediments, we could take samples down to over 2 meters depth. And some of the selected samples were sent to the lab where they were studied for microfossils. And the microfossils can then tell us whether these areas were wet or dry in the past. And some core features have also been dated through C14 analysis of plant remains. And what I say so far, and this is really important, is that what we found so far are only seemingly natural channels, and we haven't found any constructed stone structures such as been found, for example, if you've heard about the sort of boat repair yard that's been suggested for the Isle of Skye. So here I wanted to talk you through some of the mapping work that we've done. So this first map shows the present day topography, and onto that topography we've added the stream channels that came out from the modelling of the water levels. So you can see a number of streams sort of spreading across this area of the West Mainland, and we identified what can be called a mainstream, and this is the main flow of water, and that's where we have concentrated our efforts in terms of field work. And on this map as well, you can see where we have taken our core samples and also where we carry out the geophysical survey. So the red here shows where we've taken the core samples. Also here at the top of the Loch Banks. And then the place where we carried out geophysical survey is this area here between Loch Banks and Loch Boardhouse, and I'll tell you more about this area later. The next map here then is this one, which shows exactly the same area, but here we've highlighted the wetland areas that would have been prone to flooding prior to artificial drainage. And you can see that this fits in quite nicely with the mainstream that we've identified, and it also shows you how low-lying these areas are. And then finally, this is the sort of a digital terrain model. It shows you the elevation of the landscape. This is really very important to show you how flat this landscape really is. So the core areas around the main stream or the main flow of the water is all below 1 degree. So the green here is 0.2 to 1 degree. And then there are some areas that are below 5 degrees. So it's all incredibly low-lying. And this area here, which I said I'll come back to, is mainly below 1, and some of it is below 5. So the previous maps, I think, really showed you that we have a clear network of interlinked channels, streams, and lochs, and that they were, present quite far back in time, and but have been, that whole sort of water system has been changed by later agricultural drainage. So what about dates then? Can we date this system of waterways? Well, we can't. Unfortunately, we can't. But what we can say is that by looking at the deposits that have been added over time, it seems that overall conditions didn't change significantly since the Iron Age. It seemed to remain more or less the same until the time when agricultural drainage was put into place. Well, we can see some change since the Iron Age is the lochs, because they seem to be become gradually infilled with silt, and eventually only the larger lochs have remained open water. So even if we then imagine a landscape that was gradually silting up, so we have wetland areas, but they were gradually changing, becoming more difficult to navigate, we can absolutely envisage a scenario where people of the Norse period would have worked to keep navigable pathways open for as long as possible. We know that people of the Viking Age were, very much in favour of doing this. We have the well-known example in the canal in Denmark, from the island of Samsø in Denmark. It's a huge canal that seems to have been created in the 8th century. So I think that's a possibility that we absolutely have to keep in mind. And there's been some interesting studies on the west coast and the Western Isles as well of Scotland, such as this one. We've got the last point on my slide here, the study from South Uist, that suggests that some waterways have been kept open also into the post-medieval period. So if access by boat is crucial, then it's possible to keep waterways open. And something that's of course really, really important to bear in mind is that we are talking about boats with shallow draft. So they don't need a lot of water in order to be able to move through the landscape. The vessels that we know of the Viking Age and later are exactly of that type. If we look at the boat from the Sandy boat burial, the Viking Age boat burial, that boat was 6.5 meters long, and that's very typical for an inland vessel of that time period, and it had very shallow draft. And Ole Krumlin Pedersen, who is an expert on boats of the Viking Age, he's also said that vessels that were used to navigate inland waters often had a draft of less than 1/2 meter. And on the right here, I took a picture of a traditional Swedish boat. These are boats that, see how similar they are to boats of the Viking period. They're absolutely built with the same technique and very, very similar design. These were used until the late 19th century, and they're called church boats. And this is how people who lived on inland lochs, this is how they travelled to church. And again, they really don't need a lot of deep water. So these are the kinds of vessels that we are talking about. So then that might perhaps make it easier to understand how they could perhaps travel through an interconnected landscape containing of small lochs, waterways, perhaps wetlands at times. And now we come to one of the most interesting areas, really, and that I've hinted at a few times in this presentation. And this is the area between the Loch of Banks and the Loch of Portage. And you remember seeing on the topographic map or the elevation model that this area is a little bit higher than the rest. And this is the area where looking at the landscape and looking at the maps and the modeling, we couldn't really find any indication of a channel interlinking these two lochs. And this is one of the main reasons why we also carry out geophysics in this area, so to see if there's any trace of a cut channel underneath the modern topsoil. But we couldn't find any. So that makes it interesting to think about. Could we find a connection here anyway? And looking at the topography, then the elevation rises here to a maximum of just under 20 meters, and that's 7 meters higher than the Loch of Banks. So there is a bit of a slope here. It's not massive, and I would argue that this is most likely a portage site, because if you are traveling all the way up this waterway and you want to get further into the Loch of Portage, this area I don't think would have stopped people. And the reason I'm saying that is that portages are well recorded in the Viking Age. We have a lot of place name evidence, for example, and other evidence that's showing the use of portages in Scandinavia and in Scotland and in other areas of Viking expansion too. And I would say that we can, envisage perhaps a portage not just between the Loch of Banks and the Loch of Portage, but also perhaps in other areas in this waterway, if they were difficult to pass, that perhaps there would have been portages there. So creating an interlinked communication system. And again, that's not something that was alien to people of the Viking Age. We do have evidence indicating that that such systems could be in place. Yeah, so let's look at portages a little bit further in more detail. So the use of portages, so there's places where boats were carried across or pulled across land. They appear in quite a few written sources. They are mentioned in sagas, for example. So we are told about kings, for example, King Olav Haraldsson, that when they needed to move their fleets, and sometimes they needed to move them considerable distances, they did so overland if needed, and even across mountain passes. And by looking at place names, thinking about Scandinavia at the moment, the Old Norse word for a portage site or an isthmus is eid. That translates, for example, to ed in modern place names, and there are a huge number of place names like that in Scandinavia, and they tend to donate very small isthmus areas where we can really see, between lochs, for example, and we can see that these are places where boats were pulled across. And another really interesting aspect is that we know that portages were used when Scandinavians in the Viking Age traveled across or along the Russian rivers. So the Russian rivers are really, really quite tricky to travel. You need small boats, not ships. So, boats like the ones where I mentioned for the West Mainland, of the type of the sandy boat burial, that type of length. People have made journeys in modern times with reconstructed Viking Age vessels, and they tried first of all with big ships, and it just was not possible. And then they made new attempts with these smaller boats of up to 7 meters in length, and that's the way that they can travel. on along the rivers, but the Russian rivers are quite tricky. There are a number of rapids and other places where you just cannot pass by boat. And so the way to get around this is to use portages. So to take the boat up and have wooden rollers and pull the boat alongside the water. And that's been, that's a well documented practice. It's important, also to think about the Viking ships as being very light. So reconstructions of Viking ships using traditional tools, so that means particularly axes and no saws. When if you splinter wood using axes, then they split along the natural lines, and you get very, very, very pliable sort of wooden planks. And because the planks are so thin, the vessels themselves are not particularly heavy either. So the early reconstructions of Viking boats and ships, they used sword planks, and that means that the planks were far too heavy, and these ships were incredibly heavy and difficult to maneuver. So it's important to reconstruct them just using the same tools that people had and used in the Viking Age. And what's been shown through experiments as well is that you need 10, 15, maximum 20 people to pull boats really overland. And there was a test done with school children when they set out sort of a route lined by wooden rollers, and the school children quite easily pulled a boat more than a kilometre without much effort. So, what's something that might seem really, really difficult, actually, with the right type of boat and the right implements, actually works quite well. And something that's been documented for other areas, for example, in northern Sweden, where road systems were not in place until much, much later, that wooden rollers were kept at key locations where boats often cross. So this is like having a little bit of road in place for boats to travel between different water routes. And we have some interesting examples of these types of place names in Scotland too. There are a number of place names that are derived from the Old Norse term eith. As I said, that's the Portage place name. And we have Lunasting in Shetland. And part of this place name is derived from Lunner eith, where Lunner then refers to these wooden rollers that were used for pulling boats across land. And if you look at this place, you can see that it's very clearly it's a narrow isthmus, and this is a good place for pulling boats across land, and it is documented as a portage place really late on in time as well. So I think this is something that we need to see as part of the communication system of the Norse period in Scotland. So far I've concentrated on the area north of the Loch of Harry and going up to the Loch of Bord House. But once we'd sort of established that this area was probably a water route and perhaps with a portage, then we started looking at the whole of the West Mainland and to see how communication could have taken place in this area. So let me talk you through our thinking here. So we can really see a possibility of travelling from the Bay of Ireland all the way to Bursey, the Earldom stronghold, and the northern end of the West Mainland. So first of all, we've got the place called the Brig of Waith here, which would have been open and navigable from at least 4,000 years ago, and that's been shown by Richard Bates and his colleague in an article that they published in 2016. So this is open, And then they, of course, travel in the Loch of Stennis, which is not a problem. And then passing through into the Loch of Harry through a narrow channel just to the south of Brodgar. And this is where we have the Watchstone, the Neolithic standing stone, which I'll come back to later on. And then, of course, traveling through the Loch of Harry and up through the water route that I've been discussing so far, perhaps with a portage into the Loch of Portage, and cross the Loch of Portage. And then at the end of that, we have a small sort of gorge-like connection. Today it looks like a stream between the Loch of Portage and Bursey. And if that was also navigable, that would take us all the way out to the coast and close to the Broch of Bursey. So this then creates this potential water route all the way through. And thinking then about the earldom administrative arrangements and the earldom estates that I mentioned earlier, we need to see them in a completely different light. So they were not located inland, they were located by a major communication route. So the Husaby farm is found along this route. We also have the Stade farm, you remember, sitting around the Lochs of Harry and Stennis. So they are, again, in the key location. And I would also like to stress, of course, this is not just about the earldom, this is also about everybody else. The presence of this water route would have been, made life easier for everybody in terms of traveling, carrying people, cargo, anything that needed to be traveling over land. When there are no proper roads, can be really, really time consuming. Roads tend to get really wet and difficult to use. So travel by water, it tends to be easier. But of course, if you can go in inland lochs rather than all the way around following the coast, is much easier. So I think this could have been something that would have been time saving, effort saving for everybody. And if we're thinking about the possibility of people having kept these waterways open in areas that may have been prone to silting up, I think there would have been a huge incentive for people to actually try and keep these roads open or waterways open. And this is actually something that you see in Scandinavia quite a lot. For example, there are many runestones from the 11th century that refer to bridge building, road building. So this is something that people definitely partook in, and they're very happy to tell other people about it too. I think this was something that people carried out for the common good. Right, okay, so we have one more interesting place name that I wanted to talk about, and this is Wattle Farm by Bordhouse Loch. So on the northern part of Bordhouse Loch, and I've marked it here with a red circle. This place name is derived from another Old Norse word. This is Vetsla, so this is food renders paid to a lord. And this is also one of the names for one of the Orkney scats or Orkney taxes, the wattle tax. So these are, just like with the Husaby, seem to be some sort of food renders paid, probably in kind. And Marwick, he suggested that this was a farm with the obligation of providing provender for the Norse earls when resident in Bursey. So if this farm is going to provide for the earls, then we need food also to be transported to this farm. And if we envisage this water route, then the location of this farm makes a lot of sense as well. It would be relatively easy to transport food and perhaps cattle, etc., to the farm. And this could then represent a really important part of the earldom organisation for food supplies. And the presence of the water put this farm too in a new light. So another place name that it's really important to look at in relation to this water route, and that's the place name or the farm name Worth, and it's marked by a star here on this map on your right hand side. And this place name is from the Old Norse Varda, which translates as beacon. And this place name is found in many parts of Orkney. It's what lies behind the Ward Hills, and these are seen as beacon locations. And of course, the hills are, you know, there's like they're high up, and they would be really good for, you know, being part of a signal system. So this place name then, this Worth place name here, is low-lying and in an area with a high density of drainage ditches. So this is an area that's really been modified a lot, and it's not seen as a true site because it's so low-lying. But again, we went to Scandinavia for comparisons, and we looked at Denmark, where they have, you know, the same place name. And if you are familiar with the geography of Denmark, you'll know that it is really a very flat landscape. And there's evidence from Denmark that this place name, this is a Danish Worth, was used as a kind of watchtower or beacon site in low-lying locations on waterways. And the Roskilde Fjord, which is a really important inland fjord, and that really took people to the heart of the kingdom. And it seems that there were a number of these Worth place names along this waterway, and it's suggested that this marks a number of watchtowers that would have been marking the water route and creating a defense system through interconnecting viewpoints. And it has been suggested that signal systems of this kind were established in many fjords in the 11th century. So if we look at the Worth place name on the West Mainland, the one I was talking about just now, and we've been carrying out an intervisibility analysis. So that is working out the line of sight from the place name Worth to other areas on the West Mainland. So this map here, the green areas show they represent what is visible from the Worth place name marked with a star there. And what is really interesting then is that we have a clear line of sight from Worth to the watchstone, the Neolithic standing stone, sort of just by the Brodgar Peninsula. And so that is a clear line of sight from Worth to the watchstone. And the name watchstone is of course a Victorian name most likely, but its location really does suggest that this may have been used for navigation purposes. And interestingly, we also have a clear line of sight from Worth down to so the area around the Brig of Waith, where there is another farm. This one is another Varda place names, but this one's named Wart, and it may well have been then that this created an intervisibility system, a signal system that helped navigation through this channel. So at the beginning of this talk, I said that I would also mention thing sites, and I've now come to that part of this presentation, but I wanted to start with looking at some of the thing sites from Scandinavia. And I mean, I've studied thing sites in Scandinavia, in Orkney, Shetland, Iceland, Faroes, Greenland, etc. So I have a huge number of thing sites to compare, and they share a number of traits. And today I'm not going to go through many of them, but I'm going to talk about the key trait, and that is that they are found in places of good communication. They are often found by major waterways and land routes where they meet, just that we saw the same for the Husaby farms. And of course, the main reason for this is that these are places of, gathering, assembly. This is the places where decisions are made, and this is how people met. So these places have to be easily accessible. There is no point in having a meeting place that people can't get to. So I picked a place or an area of northern Sweden on this, and that's what you can see on this map to your right. So the grey here represents the Baltic, and this is the northeast coast of Sweden. And we have a number of provinces: Hälsingland, Medelpad, Ångermanland. And the white circles represent some of the main thing sites in these districts. And as you can see, they are situated right on major water routes. That's the case with the bottom two here, although it doesn't perhaps clearly come out as clear on the map as it should be. So and apart from having the waterway location, there are also major land routes that lead to these places, and in these areas, these are major ridges or eskers remains of the last ice age, and these were used as land routes throughout prehistory. So here we have convergence of different types of water routes and land routes just right at these assembly places. And when I've been looking at thing sites in other areas too, then it's very clear that we see the same pattern everywhere. The type of routes vary, but that's because geography and topography is not the same in every single area. But what is clear is that these places are found in places of good communication. So that takes me to my final slide, and I wanted to talk a little bit then about thing sites in Orkney. I have mapped them all, and the thing sites that I have been able to identify really fit the pattern that I've outlined for Scandinavia really well. They are easy to travel to. One of the big questions for Orkney is always, where was the main assembly of Orkney? And I have suggested that it was Maeshowe. And there are many reasons why I've suggested this. I'm not going to go through them all now, but I thought I'd give you a quick run through of all my reasons. And first of all, then, we know that many of the thing sites in Scandinavia are marked by mounds, quite often large mounds. They tend to be mounds created in the migration period. And looking at the size of those mounds and compare that to Maeshowe, they're very, very similar in size. I think Maeshowe would have fitted the bill perfectly in that sense. In other parts of Scotland where we have thing sites, and in Orkney too, Broch mounds tend to be used, and they are of course turf covered mounds today, and they would have been so in the Viking Age as well. So it's very clear that many of the thing sites, they tend to have mounds. People in the Viking Age also very keen on reusing various features. So we have offcoft and standing stones at assembly sites, and I think that the Neolithic ritual remains around Maeshowe, around Brodgard, the stones of Stennis, etc., would have been absolutely perfect for them. The name Maeshowe translates as meadow mound, and of course it is a mound sitting in a meadow, and the meadow is the Old Norse word mother, which is one of those elements that do appear in names that belong to thing sites in Scandinavia. There are many thing site names that refer to flat level ground that's suitable for meeting on, and meadow is one of those. Thinking about communication, when I was studying this, I was looking mainly then at its location next to the Loch of Stennis and Harry. You know, that makes sense. There are also a number of land routes that meet around Maes Howe. It's sort of a natural meeting point for travelling across the West Mainland. So that made sense as well. But I would say that with this new water route, if we can envisage people coming from across the West Mainland through inland water routes, the location and the selection of Maes Howe as the main assembly site makes a lot, even more sense to me than before. So I would like to say that I think that my argument is strengthened further. So this is where I would like to stop, and I would just like to say the last few words that I think is so interesting to think about how the landscape has changed over time, that the landscape that we see today is not a natural landscape necessarily. It's been changed by actions of people over a number of, huge periods of time. So it's important that a landscape is not static, but it's continuously changing. But also, I think one of the most important outcomes of this project is that there are so many clues in the landscape that we can use to try and work back through the layers and see what the landscape was like in a different time period. And we are very pleased with these results, and we are very much hoping to develop a new project, a bigger project, to study this further and take this study of the Orkney landscape and water routes and water communications in Orkney even further. So thank you all for listening, and I will be happy to answer questions in the live session.